Hey guys, so we of course had several YCS level events lately, and so as usual I wanted to take the time to make a tier list of the best hand traps and staples using Dueling Book data from YG Scope, as well as data based on the cards that were in the topping list of these YCS level events. So now, because of the way I do these tier list videos, unfortunately it is going to be based on current format data, which means it's not going to reflect technically, the format post new ban list that's going to take into effect next week. But at the same time, I think for the most part the cards will stay about the same, and we can also have a little discussion on which cards may change in terms of trends. So big thanks to my sponsors as always. Definitely go check out my discount codes on Yu-Gi-Oh singles as well as supplies. So let's just get started with this month's tier list, and we are going to start off with Ash Blossom. And so, not too surprising, almost always this is the most played hand trap in pretty much any topping list at YCS or regional level event. In this format though, Ash definitely can be really impactful against a lot of strategies. Like for example, Rescue Ace has been known where, Ash on Emergency is very, very strong. You also have a lot of Chimera, maybe on the decline a little bit now, but you know what, Ash on Mirror Sword Knight is really, really strong. Against Purrely, it's kind of hit or miss, to be honest with you. Against Unchained, I mean, when I surveyed those Unchained players, they actually said that Ash can sometimes actually have a really, really big impact as well. So I think, especially moving forward to the next format, post-ban list where, you do have Purrely and Unchained as being the best decks, and Chimera is kind of out of the mix, and you have still Chimera in there as well, and Rescue Ace. I think Ash is still definitely deserving of a #1 spot. We also do have Feather Duster, which, there's not much to say about this card. There's no drawbacks, might as well just blow out back row, and definitely seeing a lot of play in top deck list as well. Next, we're going to go into Imperm, and this one's a little interesting because I was actually watching Jesse Cotton's staple tier list video, which you should certainly check out. It's an hour long, but it's really, really insightful. I actually watched it twice, and so he was actually saying that this was not really, he's not really a big fan of this card, and I totally understand it. I think, for these tier lists that I'm doing, it's more so based on, purely data in terms of how often they're actually played. It doesn't necessarily always reflect how exactly, impactful it might be, right? I mean, a lot of times, sure, they do overlap, and that's the reason why it's being seeing a lot of play, but sometimes it doesn't, and so I can definitely understand his thought process. So definitely, again, go check out his tier list. So next we're on to Talents, and of course, incredibly strong card. I mean, going first, you can really punish your opponent if they hand trap you and just rip a card out of the hand, or maybe if you're really desperate, you have to draw 2. Well, maybe that kind of solves things for you. Or going second, this is just absolutely devastating. Can really lead to easy OTKs, especially against Unchained. You don't really want to pop your opponent's cards. You want to just take things away, which is why certain cards let's say even Change of Heart is seeing a bit more play again. So Talents definitely really, really strong and deserving of that A tier. So next we do have Book of Moon, which, you can always make the argument between, Book of Moon versus Book of Eclipse, which one is more impactful. They all have their pros and cons. I think technically Book of Eclipse probably actually is more impactful, but, purely in terms of, how often it was played among the topping list from the YCS events, for example, Book of Moon actually did see decently more amount of play, and especially it was more so of a main deck card than Book of Eclipse, again, at least among those lists that topped. But you know what, post-ban list, the books in general, I think will be good. You do still have Purrely, and as long as they didn't make their 5 Noir on their own turn, the book cards can still be very, very good. Next, moving on to next year, we do have Nibiru, which is still good, especially with now post-ban list, Unchained going to be the best deck, and Nibiru can definitely be quite good against that strategy. It's not necessarily a end-all be-all, but at the same time, really good. Obviously, with Chimera kind of going out of the mix, and this card was also really good as long as they didn't just go right into a Rise Art Pass, for example. So I think for now, you're still going to see a good amount of Nibiru as well. Definitely something you do have to respect. And then we were already kind of talked about this Book of Eclipse. Definitely, between Book of Moon, Book of Eclipse, which one would you rather play? Or maybe if you have room, just play both. I think it will still be good next format as well. So being able to, especially the fact that it does not target, can also come up, right? For example, you have a lot of Chimera still being played right now, and, Cornfield can protect from targeting effects for some reason, and so at least Eclipse can handle that as well. So next we do have D-Barrier, which of course against certain matchups is just absolutely devastating. So, against Purrely, Call Xyz, or let's say Chimera, or just Branded in general, you call Fusion, and it's kind of GG for them for the most part. They of course, will have to play something like Crossout if they really want to try to have a chance against D-Barrier. So I think it's fair that it's in B tier, just because it's not something you can play against every deck, but, against the right decks, it's really, really strong. So I'm a little worried post-balance this might actually see an uptick in play, just because, against Chimera, like sure you could call Xyz with D-Barrier, but for the most part they're just going to be able to OTK you under D-Barrier anyways, especially if this was like your only interruption that you were kind of relying on. And now with Chimera the mix, maybe they actually can focus a bit more on Purrely even more now, and they can have D-Barrier of course against, you know, Unchained, not really the best, and as well as like Rescue Ace, they probably don't really care either, so you know, those things to keep in mind. Next we have Lightning Storm, which again, I guess similar to like Feather Duster, I don't think there's too much to say. I mean, you might as well just blow back row. Obviously against Unchained, they can like kind of trigger their traps, but at the same time, you know, against most other strategies, they at least have some form of back row that you can get rid of, especially in like current format where you also have a lot of, you know, cards like Books or like Imperm being set and being played. Then we have Thrust, which again, I've kind of already talked about this in combination with Talent. It's just really strong card. I mean, realistically, I think it's also in the A tier. I guess it's because not as many people play this in comparison to Talents, but for the most part, you know, you're probably, a lot of you are probably on this. Being able to, you know, set something like D-Barrier going first, or Eradicator, although Eradicator maybe not nearly as good in the current format, and then, you know, going second, like Evenly, Dark Ruler, Lightning Storm, Feather Duster, just really versatile going first or second. So I definitely think this is, you know, a card that is really strong and worthy in your deck. Next we have Cosmic Cyclone. This has kind of been declining the last month. Actually, it's a little, I mean, maybe it's not too surprising. I mean, obviously against Unchained, if you go first, then against Unchained, you know, it's actually pretty good. Like when they start with like a set trap or something, you know, at least you can banish it. Against Purrely, you know, if they have like Happy Memory to protect their, like, I don't know, my friend Purrely, you can also banish it. But, you know, there's, at the same time, there's been like a decline in like, let's say runic builds, for example, again with Cornfield's targeting protection. You know, Cyclone unfortunately does not go as hard. And so I think it's still good. You know, Anti-Spell Fragments is still kind of in the format as well, and this is kind of like your main bet, or let's say Twin Twisters, but Twin Twisters hasn't really been popular for the last like half year or so. So Cosmic Cyclone, I think it's still good, but kind of understandable in terms of its decline. And then we also have Droll. Speaking of decline, this is definitely a big example of this because, you know, compare that to the beginning of Duelist Nexus format where everyone was like really scared of like Mannadium going into the format, and Droll was like actually literally the most played hand trap in like all the regional topping lists when I did the analysis. Now it's definitely fallen off, although, you know, it is definitely very format dependent, and, you know, when people are not respecting Droll anymore, who knows, maybe that means that's where like all the Mannadium players actually start coming back again, you know, into, especially heading into the next ban list. And, you know, with Chimera out of the mix, you know, Droll, while Droll can be good against Chimera, obviously if they have something like Shifter, you know, it's just completely dead. And same can be said kind of like now, especially with, you know, Flunder probably seeing gonna see more play, especially because it has a better matchup against Unchained as well. And then we also have Herald of the Abyss. This is something kind of in line with, you know, against something like Purrely, where it is just like a good way to get rid of X-Purrely Noir, and it was actually seeing more play than Xyz Encore, even though technically I think Xyz Encore is better against specifically Purrely, for example, but at least Herald of the Abyss, it is a normal spell, which means you can get it off something like Thrust, which I think is why it saw more play. That's probably pretty straightforward. So, you know, moving to the next format, obviously it's still going to be good, especially with Purrely still being a really top strong deck, and a lot of decks are going to struggle outing X-Purrely Noir. So Herald of the Abyss, you know what, still something to consider. From a Dueling Book perspective, it's kind of funny because it sees almost like no play online, and that's kind of because, you know, Dueling Book, it's just like a complete like open crapshoot in terms of like matchups, and it's not really, you know, all meta decks like you would see in like a YCS level event, for example. So I think that kind of explains why. Next, we are going to go into Evenly Match. I also think this is a very strong card, but actually has been kind of falling a little bit in terms of play. I guess, you know, it's like Unchained. You know, it's not terrible, but it's also not amazing, just because they can actually recover quite well under Evenly. You know, they are going to be able to like keep the Caesar, and then they can like pop their cards and then eventually bring them back after Evenly resolves. Against Purrely, you're still not outing X-Purrely Noir. At least you can get rid of like the back row though, like, and also my friend Purrely, like the field spell, you know, the recursion, which is always kind of nice, but again, you don't out the main issue. Against Chimera though, it's actually really strong unless they have something like, let's say, Dragoon. Otherwise, you know, Chimera builds, especially because, you know, Chimera Fusion can only be used in the main phase. You could also always bluff an Evenly and just try to go to battle phase and see what they do. So I think Evenly is still really strong if you have the room to play it. So next, let's cover Bestial Druidsworm, and at that point, we might as well also cover Magma Nut. And so, you know, I think the way the scoring system worked out, this kind of makes sense. I think Druidsworm definitely is a little bit better in terms of the Unchained matchup, you know, being able to not only banish, let's say, like Yama, but also at least, you know, being able to send rather than destroying. That's always kind of nice. And with Magma Nut going to 1 in this new ban list, you know, who knows, maybe that forces players to just, you know, not only play just the one Magma Nut, but maybe more Druidsworm as well. And so I think these will definitely still be relevant moving into the next format. We also have Dimension Shifter. Unfortunately, it is still going to be around next format as well. And we just saw Thunder win the YCS. And so they are, of course, now, once again, the best deck that can play Shifter. Now that Chimera is presumably definitely going to fall out of at least the tier 1 conversation. So Dimension Shifter definitely not fun to play against. Definitely really screws most other strategies. But you know what? If you're a deck that can play Shifter, you're probably going to have a really good time. So next we do have Call by the Grave, which has definitely seen a lot of decline in terms of play the last like even a year or so. I mean, you know, obviously if you're playing a deck like any kind of branded variant, you're going to need this for that Ash because it just absolutely destroys you. Or let's say you're playing Mannadium and you really need it against something like Droll. So those kind of situations make sense. We're not really in the situation, let's say, clear example was back then when we were in like the DP pile format where DP, like being able to banish that, Call by the Grave was really good for that, aside from also being able to stop hand traps. But we're not really in that kind of situation anymore, so I can definitely see why this is kind of fallen in terms of play. So next we do have Kaijus in general, and you know, while Chimera, it was also really good against you know, something like a Rise Heart, and while Chimera might be falling out of tier 1 status, we still have something like Purrely, Purrely Noir. You can just always plop a Kaiju over it, so that's always nice. And even against Unchained, you know, at least being able to Kaiju something, it does not like pop anything, so that's also kind of nice to have. So I think pretty worthwhile in your side deck as well if you have this space. So next we have Destructive Karma Cannon, and so this is a card that's actually been popular for the last few months, just as a card to set off of thrust, and essentially serves as another way to book your opponent's monsters. So I think, you know, moving into the next format as well, this is definitely still going to see a decent amount of play, again, because so many players are running thrust, and you know, while this card was also really good against Chimera, and now with them kind of going out of the mix, but at the same time, I think this will still see a decent amount of play. So next we have Crossout, which, you know, in a deck like, let's say, Purrely, where they have a lot of non-engine space, they will probably play this because they can play, you know, their hand traps, their books, and also the Crossout, just to have a chance against something like the D-Barrier that we mentioned earlier, but also even against something like other hand traps and also the book cards as well, and something like Chimera, that's also a deck that will play Crossout often just because of how easily it can lose to something like Ash on Mirror Sword Knight or Imperm on the Berfermet. So Crossout can be really good against certain decks. And then we also have Valor, probably not nearly seeing as much play just because, you know, the decks that are probably playing this are like Purrely and also like Chimera because they're drawing on like the opponent's turn, and in that instance, you know, Valor is better than Imperm, but for the most part, you're probably playing Imperm if you're not playing those decks. And then finally, moving on to the final tier, we do have Ghost Spell, which is kind of definitely seeing a lot of decline in terms of play. I think, you know, if you're a deck that gets hurt by the Bestials a lot, this was something that you could possibly play just as a way to protect your own cards, but also serve as a way to interrupt your opponent. Now with, you know, let's say, for example, Bestial Magma going to 1, maybe it declines even further, or maybe it actually goes up, or at least stays the same just because maybe people just make it up for it with just playing more Druid's Worm. So definitely something to keep an eye out for, but for the most part, it's probably not in a lot of people's decks. And then we also have Super Poly, which is, you know, a card that obviously Chimera is going to play for the most part, like any kind of branded variant. You also have like Rescue Ace playing this as well, because they have kind of a flexible extra deck space as well. So I don't think it's like too amazing. Like against Unchained, you can definitely hit them sometimes. Like, you know, the Caesar is like a Water Fiend, and I think it was Rakia that was Water Fiend as well, or they have also like Darks as well. Against something like Purrely, I find it's not great at all. Like if you go first and you're playing something like branded, you can probably make it live, but going second against Purrely, I find Super Poly is just not good at all, and so definitely can see why it's kind of in this D category. And finally, we have Dark Ruler No More, which of course is definitely a card that's fallen off in terms of play the last few months. You know, we no longer have some kind of like Sprite variant as tier 1 anymore, which is where this card really shined. Right now, you know, you have like Purrely, let's say like Purrely Noir. If it has 5 mats, it's not going to care about Dark Ruler no more. Even Unchained that can play under Dark Ruler as well. And I mean, against Chimera, you know, you at least shut off the Phantom Beast effect, and so it's no longer considered as like the Flying Mythical Beast. So you shut off Cornfield as well as something like the Mirror Sword Knight Monster Negate. But you know, more or less, like it's not too hot. Moving into the next format, will it change that much? Maybe not too much. Now, there are some other cards that I didn't get to cover in this tier list. One of the prime examples is Chimera Fenrir. The reason for this is because I'm using like Dueling Book data from YCS, and you know, Chimera is played in actual Chimera decks right now, so it's really hard to parse that out. So I unfortunately decided just not to include it. Otherwise, it would be scored really high just purely because Chimera plays it so much. And so of course, you know, it's a really good card. It did not get hit on the ban list, which is kind of weird, but you know what? It means you should probably pick them up if you don't have them already, and you can always use my code Hakuna5 to get 5% off on Yu-Gi-Oh singles at either Card Brawlers or Tier 0 games. So Phantasme is another card that kind of saw a bit of a play in the last little bit. You know, it's something that you can use against something like, let's say, Dragon Link, which of course did get hit a little bit on this ban list, and also something like Unchained as well. It can come up. I mean, it actually did not see that much play in the topping list though, so it's certainly something that you can try out if you have the space. Otherwise, maybe try playing other cards. Droplet is another one that, while right now, because of Chimera, is not seeing much play, it's definitely something that might see an uptick in play just because of, you know, Chimera being gone and the shifter-like effects, but at the same time, you do still have to consider, you know, something like, let's say, Flunder. They are going to be around again because of its Unchained matchup, and they are a shifter deck, so some things to consider, but at least probably will see a bit more play than it is right now. Alright, so that was it for the staple tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully you found that helpful in terms of helping you build your main and side deck as you approach the new format. Definitely really thanks to all of you for watching the video. A huge thanks to my patrons as always for their continued support, and well, take care guys.